The award in my hands is heavy, solid gold and carved oak, the National Prize for Historical Preservation. The applause from the Grand Ballroom in Charleston washes over me a warm wave that can't quite reach the cold, hollow space in my chest, because as my eyes scan the crowd, they land on table 7. It's perfectly set white linen, polished silver, a centerpiece of roses, and it's completely empty. My family's table, in the biggest moment of my career, the one I'd worked my entire life for, they chose not to show up. Their absence is a statement louder than any applause. My name is Clara. I'm 31 years old. And that empty table, it wasn't a surprise. It was a summary. A lifetime of being the other child condensed into one perfectly set, devastatingly empty table. Growing up, my brother Kenneth and I inherited 2 different legacies from the same family. He was given the future, I was given the past. When he looked at an empty plot of land, he saw skyscrapers and profit margins. When I looked at an old, crumbling building, I saw stories etched in brick and mortar, a history worth saving. Our parents, Frank and Patricia, saw the same thing. They called Kenneth's vision ambition. They called mine a hobby. I remember being 8 years old, sketching the intricate details of the old courthouse downtown. I spent weeks on it, capturing every crack in the facade, every weathered gargoyle. I presented it to my father, my chest, tight with pride. He glanced at it, a quick, dismissive nod. "That's nice, dear." A moment later, Kenneth burst in with a Lego tower, a chaotic jumble of red and blue bricks. "Dad, look. It's the future headquarters of Harrison Industries." My father's face lit up. He got down on the floor, examining the clumsy structure like it was a masterpiece. "Look at that, Patricia. The boy's a natural developer. He's got vision." That word. Vision. It was reserved exclusively for Kenneth. His C+ in economics was a sign of a burgeoning tycoon who couldn't be bothered with petty details. My A+ in history was nice. His poorly written proposal for a neighborhood car wash was framed and hung in Dad's study. My award-winning essay on Charleston's architectural heritage was filed away in a drawer somewhere. The favoritism was a constant low-grade hum in the background of our lives, a noise you get so used to you forget it's there. Looking back, it's easy to see the cruelty in that. But the most effective cruelty isn't loud, it's quiet. It isn't a single violent act. It's 1,000 tiny dismissals that accumulate over years until they form the very foundation of your reality. In a family system like ours, this kind of treatment becomes normalized. It's not seen as abuse, it's just the way things are. Frank and Patricia weren't monsters. They were just parents who'd written a script early on. Kenneth was the star, the one destined for success, the one whose dreams were a worthy investment. I was the supporting character, the reliable, quiet one who didn't need as much attention. Once those roles are cast, the family performs the play every single day without even thinking about it. Kenneth gets the applause. Clara gets the quiet expectation to not make a fuss. It's a trap, you see. A prison without bars, where the walls are built from years of being told, "That's nice, dear," while the real celebration happens in the next room. My invisibility wasn't a punishment. It was just part of the household routine, as normal as taking out the trash. This dynamic followed us into adulthood. When it came time for college, Kenneth declared he was going into real estate development. My parents paid his full tuition at a prestigious business school without blinking. When I said I wanted to study architectural preservation, my father sighed. "Clara, is there any money in that?" "It sounds sentimental." I ended up getting scholarships, working 2 jobs, and taking out loans to cover the rest. They saw it as proof of my independence. I saw it as another way I was on my own. The summer I was 20, Kenneth, flush with Dad's seed money, bought the old Hawthorne block downtown. It was a row of beautiful pre-war buildings with unique ironwork and faded brick facades. He planned to tear them all down to build luxury condos. "It's a gold mine, Clara," he'd said, spreading blueprints across the dining room table. "We're talking a $20 million project." I looked at the drawings of the generic glass and steel tower that would replace a piece of the city's soul. "You can't," I whispered. "Those buildings are historic." He laughed. "They're old and falling apart. It's called progress. You should try it sometime." I spent that entire summer campaigning to get the Hawthorne Block designated as a historic district. I wrote letters, spoke at city council meetings, and organized a petition. My parents were mortified. "You're embarrassing your brother," my mother told me, over the phone, her voice cold. "He's trying to build a career, and you're standing in his way over some old bricks." I lost, of course. Kenneth had the money and the connections. The Hawthorne Block was demolished a year later. I drove past the construction site, once saw the gaping hole where a century of stories used to stand, and I promised myself I would never again let their definition of success diminish mine. So I built my own world, one historic building at a time. A world where my passions weren't a liability. A world where I didn't need their applause to know I'd done good work. It was a lonely world, but it was mine. After the Hawthorne Block was gone, I stopped trying. Not all at once. It was a gradual retreat, a slow, quiet construction of a wall around my heart. I'd get a small grant for a research project, and for a split second I'd feel that old, familiar urge to call home to share the news. Then I'd remember my father's bored tone, my mother's quick pivot to whatever Kenneth was doing, and I'd put the phone down. The first time I consciously kept a major success from them was my first solo project. I'd won a contract to restore the facade of the old city library. It was a huge deal for a young architect. I remember standing across the street looking at the finished work, the sandstone glowing in the afternoon light, and feeling a profound sense of accomplishment. I took a picture and was about to send it to the family group chat when a text from my mother came through. "Kenneth just closed on that waterfront property. We're all so proud. Dinner tonight to celebrate." I stared at the photo on my phone, then at her message, and I just deleted the picture. I texted back, "Sounds great. Can't make it. Have to work." It was easier that way. Expecting nothing was less painful than offering up a piece of your heart only to have it handed back unexamined. So I built my wall brick by brick. Each ignored achievement was a brick. Each forgotten birthday was a brick. Each time they called asking for a favor, but never asking how I was another brick. After a few years, the wall was so high I could barely see them on the other side, and the silence was peaceful. People who haven't lived it always ask the same question: why did you stay? Why didn't you just cut them off completely? It's a logical question, but a toxic family isn't a burning building you can just run out of. It's more like a prison without bars. The doors are technically open, but you're held in place by invisible chains. There's the chain of hope, the one that whispers, "Maybe this time will be different. Maybe this time they'll see you." There's the chain of guilt, the one that clinks with phrases like, "You're being too sensitive," or "After all we've done for you." And the heaviest chain of all is duty, the one that simply says, "But they're your family." You spend years pulling against those chains, and all you get are raw, bruised wrists. Psychologists have a term for it: learned helplessness. It's what happens when you're in a situation where your efforts never change the outcome. A child who is constantly dismissed learns that sharing their joy only leads to indifference. An architect who is constantly belittled for her passion learns that her achievements are only valuable in silence. You don't stop trying because you're weak. You stop trying because you've learned through thousands of painful experiments that trying doesn't work. The silence, the distance, it isn't giving up. It's a survival strategy. You stop running toward the people who hurt you, and you learn to stand still. You learn to build a life inside your invisible prison, a life they can't touch. That's what my wall was. It was the physical manifestation of learned helplessness. I stopped sharing my successes not just because it was painful, but because I'd been conditioned to believe it was pointless. I kept the contact minimal, a birthday card, a Christmas text. It was a silent truce. I wouldn't bother them with my life, and they wouldn't have to bother pretending to care. It worked. For a while, the years passed in that quiet distance. I built my career. I won awards they never knew about. I became a respected voice in historical preservation, a world they had no interest in. And then came the National Prize Gala, the biggest award of my career. I sent the invitation a single hopeful crack in my wall, a test. Maybe this time I thought, this time is big enough, important enough. Maybe this time they'll show up. And in response, they gave me their final loudest answer, an empty table. 2 years passed after the gala. 2 years of blessed, uninterrupted silence. The empty table became a scar, a pale white line on the landscape of my memory, but it no longer ached. I'd poured myself into my work, restoring a string of historic homes along the Charleston Battery, earning a reputation for my meticulous attention to detail. I built a life in that silence, a good life. So when my phone buzzed on a Tuesday afternoon with my father's name flashing on the screen, my first instinct was to ignore it. A call from Frank was never just a call. It was a summons. It meant he needed something. But curiosity, that old treacherous feeling, got the better of me. I answered. Clara? Hi, Dad. Clara, honey, it's Dad. The word honey was so out of place it felt like a foreign object in his mouth. I was just reading an article online about your work on the East Bay Street project. Very impressive stuff. Your mother and I? We're very proud. Proud. The word I'd chased my entire childhood now delivered so casually, so cheaply, it felt like an insult. I waited. The silence stretched. He was waiting for me to thank him, to feel a surge of gratitude. I felt nothing but a cold knot of suspicion in my stomach. I'm glad you liked the article, I said, my voice neutral. Listen, he finally said, the fake warmth giving way to a more familiar, businesslike tone. The reason I'm calling is, we need to have a family meeting. Something's come up and it's important we all talk. Together. A family meeting, I repeated, the words tasting like ash. We haven't had one of those since you decided Kenneth needed a new car and I needed to get a third job. I could hear him take a sharp breath, annoyed by the reminder. This is different, Clara. This is serious. It's about Kenneth's new development, but it affects all of us. We need you here. You need me, not we miss you, not we want to see you. We need you. It was the most honest thing he'd said so far. Every instinct I had screamed at me to say no, to hang up, block his number, and retreat back into the peaceful quiet of the life I'd built. The old Clara would have. The Clara who built the wall would have reinforced it with another layer of stone. But the woman who had stood on that stage at the National Prize Gala, the woman who had accepted that award alone and survived, she was different. She wasn't afraid anymore. The architect in me saw the structural flaws in his approach. The long-ignored daughter in me just felt tired, but the strategist, the woman who had learned to survive them, was curious. What had finally broken? What crisis was so large that they suddenly remembered my name? Fine, I said the word clipped, but not at the house. A neutral place. I suggested a quiet coffee shop downtown. My territory. My terms. Tomorrow at 3, he asked, the relief in his voice palpable. I'll be there, I said, and hung up before he could say another word. I stood by my window looking out at the old steeple of St. Michael's Church, a building I'd helped restore a year ago. A lifetime ago, I would have been thrilled by that call. My heart would have been pounding with hope. Now it was just pounding with a cold, clear sense of dread. The truce was over. They were coming for something. And for the first time in my life, I was ready to find out what it was, not as a hopeful daughter, but as an architect examining the foundation of a structure she knew was about to collapse. I arrived at the coffee shop 10 minutes early. It was a small place with exposed brick and the warm smell of roasted beans, a place I'd chosen for its quiet anonymity. They were already there, all 3 of them huddled at a corner table like a tribunal. Frank, Patricia, and Kenneth. This wasn't a conversation. It was an ambush. My mother saw me first and waved a bright, brittle gesture. Clara, darling, over here. I walked over, setting my briefcase on the empty chair. Kenneth stood pulling it out for me with a politeness he'd never shown in his life. Clara, you look great, he said. Success suits you. I sat the worn leather of the booth cool against my back. What's this about? Can't a family just get together for coffee? My mother asked her smile, not quite reaching her eyes. We're not that kind of family, I said, and the smile vanished. My father cleared his throat, taking charge. Your mother's right. We should have done this sooner. We've been distant, and that's our fault. He looked at me, his eyes searching for a crack in my composure. We saw the articles about you, the National Prize, the East Bay Project. We're so incredibly proud of what you've built. The words were so practiced, so hollow. The pride was for the public version of me, the one they could claim now that she was successful. It had nothing to do with the actual person sitting in front of them. You're a real force in your field, Kenneth added, leaning forward. A true artist. I've always said it. The lie was so blatant, I almost laughed. The last thing Kenneth had said about my work was when he'd called my efforts to save the Hawthorne block sentimental nonsense. I simply nodded, taking a slow sip of the water the waitress had brought. I let them talk. For 20 minutes they performed. They asked about my work with feigned interest. They reminisced about a childhood that I didn't recognize, one where they were always my biggest supporters. They were building a case, laying a foundation of false camaraderie before they revealed the real reason I was here. Finally, my father leaned back, his performance over. Clara, he said, his voice dropping, we're in trouble. He slid a glossy folder across the table. It was a prospectus for Kenneth's latest project, a massive waterfront condominium complex. The Seabrook Tower, he said. It was going to be Kenneth's masterpiece. Was? Kenneth's face tightened. A key investor pulled out last week, unexpectedly. It triggered a clause in our loan agreement. The bank is calling the note. If we can't cover the shortfall in the next 30 days, we lose everything. How much is the shortfall? He hesitated, looking at my father. $2 million. The number hung in the air, obscene and desperate. I thought of the $21 million from my company's acquisition. They had clearly thought of it too. We wouldn't ask if it wasn't a matter of survival, my mother said, her hand fluttering to her chest in a gesture of practiced distress. Your brother has put everything into this. We've put everything into this. Our savings. Most of our retirement. You're successful now, Clara, Kenneth said, his voice low and urgent. For you, $2 million It's manageable. For us, it's the end of the line. This is what family is for. We help each other when things get tough. It's your duty, Clara, my father added, his voice hardening the mask of the proud father, slipping to reveal the familiar face of the patriarch. We gave you a good life. We supported your education. The lie was so old, so worn, but he still used it. They looked at me, then all three of them, a united front of expectation. Their faces held the same calm certainty I'd seen my whole life, the certainty that when it came down to it, I would do what was expected. I would be the sensible one, the good daughter, the one who cleans up the mess. I didn't say a word. I just looked from my father's demanding stare to my mother's pleading eyes, to my brother's entitled desperation. I thought of the empty table at the gala. I thought of the hole in the ground where the hawthorn block used to be. I thought of the years of silence. I picked up my coffee, the warmth of the mug, a small, solid anchor in the storm of their manipulation. The silence stretched. 1 second, 10, 30. They started to shift uncomfortably, their certainty beginning to fray. They had played their hand. Now it was my turn. My father broke the silence first, his voice laced with an impatience he couldn't hide. Well, Clara, we're waiting. This is a time-sensitive issue. I set my coffee cup down with a soft click that seemed to echo in the quiet room. I didn't reach for my purse. I didn't pull out my phone to open a banking app. Instead, I reached for the briefcase I'd placed on the chair beside me, laying it flat on the table and unlatching the silver clasps. Across from me, Kenneth's posture relaxed. A faint, triumphant smirk touched his lips. He thought I was getting out the loan paperwork they'd so thoughtfully prepared for me. My mother let out a small, relieved sigh. Even my father gave a curt nod, as if to say, "Good, she's finally being sensible." They thought they had won. They always did. "This is what I wanted to discuss with you," I said, my voice perfectly even betraying none of the storm raging inside me. I slid a single professionally bound document from the folder. It wasn't a checkbook. It wasn't a loan agreement. It was a prospectus. I pushed it to the center of the table. Kenneth frowned, his brow furrowing in confusion. "What's this? Some new project?" "In a way," I said. "It's the charter for a new foundation I'm establishing." "A foundation," my mother repeated the word, sounding foreign and absurd in her mouth. "Clara, this isn't the time for your little hobbies. Your brother is about to lose everything." "I'm aware," I said, my gaze sweeping across their expectant faces. "It's called the Harrison Legacy Preservation Fund, in honor of my old professor, the one who wrote my scholarship recommendations when no one else would." I let the name hang in the air for a moment before delivering the final blow. The seed funding is $16 million. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of silence that's so total you can hear the blood rushing in your own ears. My mother's perfectly applied lipstick was slightly parted her face, a mask of disbelief. My father just stared, his jaw slack. Kenneth was the first to find his voice, and when he did, it was a strangled whisper. 16 million. He looked at me then, at our parents, then back at me, as if I had just announced I was moving to Mars. "You have $16 million to just give away." "I have more than that," I said quietly, "but that's the amount I've allocated for the foundation. It's being placed in an irrevocable trust." Irrevocable. My father's voice was a low growl. He understood the word. He understood what it meant. Untouchable, unaskable, gone. "You can't do that," Kenneth exploded, slamming his hand on the table, rattling the coffee cups. "You can't just throw away that kind of money on some stupid fund for old buildings when your own brother is going bankrupt." Clara, honey, think about what you're saying, my mother pleaded, her eyes welling with tears. We're your family. Kenneth is your brother. He needs you. Did he need me when he laughed about my campaign to save the Hawthorne block? I asked, my voice still calm, still measured. Did you need me when you all decided not to show up to my national prize gala? When you left an empty table for the entire city to see? That's not fair, my father snapped. We were busy. You were busy, I repeated. And now I'm busy. I'm busy investing in things that matter to me. For my entire life, you have made it painfully clear what you value. You value Kenneth's vision, these big, flashy projects that destroy history for a quick profit. You made it clear that my passion for preservation was a worthless hobby. You made your choice. Now I'm making mine. I looked directly at Kenneth, at the man-child who had spent his life getting everything he wanted. You see, I'm choosing to invest my money in what I value, in preserving legacies, not bailing out failed ones, in supporting students who might be overlooked, just like I was. He stared at me, his face turning a blotchy red. This is revenge, he spat. You're doing this just to punish us. No, Kenneth, I said, a sad, final clarity settling over me. This isn't revenge. This is a consequence. My success is a consequence of your neglect, and what I do with that success is none of your business. I stood up, then picking up my briefcase. The funds have already been transferred. My decision is final. I believe this meeting is over. I stood there, my briefcase in hand, watching the aftershocks ripple across their faces. Kenneth was the first to recover his shock, curdling into pure, unadulterated rage. $16 million, he finally roared, the words ripping through the quiet cafe. He slammed his hand on the table again, harder this time. You're giving $16 million to a charity for some dead professor while your own family goes under. Clara, please, my mother started, her voice a high, thin whine. This is your brother's life, his future. You can't just throw it away on old buildings. It's a betrayal, my father said, his voice a low growl, a betrayal of everything this family stands for. What exactly does this family stand for? I asked, my voice dangerously quiet, because from where I'm standing, it stands for celebrating one child's reckless ambition while ignoring the other's quiet competence. It stands for showing up with your hand out after years of showing me your back. That's not fair, Kenneth yelled, his face splotchy with anger. I built a real business. I took risks. I had a vision. And now that vision has failed, I said. And you expect me to pay for it. It's not a failure, he insisted. It's a temporary setback. The project is solid. The location is prime. It just needs a capital infusion to get past this hurdle. He looked at me, then his eyes narrowing, a flicker of desperate cunning in them. You're smart, Clara. You're a business person. You'd be an investor, not just a donor. I'll give you a stake in the project. 10%. You'd make your money back tenfold. The offer was so absurd, so deeply insulting, that a small, bitter laugh escaped my lips. An investor. You want me to invest in your vision, Kenneth. The one my parents were so proud of. I leaned forward slightly. All right. Let's pretend I'm an investor. Tell me about the project. Where is this masterpiece of yours exactly? A flicker of hope ignited in his eyes. He thought he was winning. He thought my practicality, my business sense, would override the years of hurt. He thought I could be bought. It's down by the water, he said eagerly, pulling the glossy prospectus closer. The old Seabrook lot. You wouldn't know it. It's just a stretch of derelict warehouses right now, but the waterfront access is unparalleled. We got the zoning changed last year. It's a clean slate. ready for demolition. The world tilted. The buzz of the coffee shop faded to a dull roar in my ears. The old Seabrook lot. I felt the air leave my lungs in a silent rush. He didn't notice. He was too caught up in his sales pitch. Once we clear the site, we'll have the best view in Charleston. 30 stories of luxury condos. It's going to redefine the skyline. I just stared at him. The memory hit me with the force of a physical blow. A 20-year-old me standing in front of the city council, my voice trembling as I presented a portfolio of photographs and historical documents. The fight to save the Hawthorne Historic District. The fight to protect the old Seabrook warehouses. The Seabrook lot, I repeated, and my voice sounded strange, distant. You mean the Hawthorne block? Kenneth waved his hand dismissively. Whatever it was called, it's just rubble waiting to happen. The Hawthorne block, I said again louder this time, my voice gaining a sharp, brittle edge. The collection of pre-war warehouses with the cast iron facades. The ones I spent an entire summer of my life trying to get designated as a historic district. My father's eyes widened slightly. My mother's hand went to her mouth. They remembered. The ones, I continued, my voice shaking with a decade of suppressed fury that you all called a waste of time. The ones you told me to get over when the city council, influenced by a certain anonymous developer, voted against the designation. The ones you laughed about at dinner, saying I was sentimental and foolish for caring about piles of old bricks. I looked at Kenneth, and for the first time he seemed to understand. The color drained from his face. You didn't just come here asking for my money, I whispered, the words heavy with the weight of the ultimate betrayal. You came here asking me to pay for the demolition of the Hawthorne block. You want me to fund the very destruction you mocked me for trying to prevent. My voice rose raw and broken. You want me to write a check to tear down a piece of my own history, a piece of my soul, just to save your glass tower. I stood up my chair, scraping harshly against the floor. This conversation is over. I grabbed my briefcase, leaving the foundation prospectus sitting on the table like a tombstone. I walked out of that coffee shop and didn't look back, leaving them sitting there in the wreckage of a betrayal so profound not even $16 million could ever hope to fix it. I expected a storm, shouting accusations, desperate voicemails. Instead, what followed was a profound, unnerving silence. For 3 days after I walked out of that coffee shop, my phone didn't ring. No texts from my mother, no angry calls from my father, not even a single venomous message from Kenneth. It was the kind of quiet that follows a devastating earthquake, when the world is holding its breath, waiting to see what's still standing. I tried to work to lose myself in the blueprints for a historic renovation project on Trad Street, but the silence was a constant distraction. It felt tactical. They were regrouping, planning their next move. The first tremor came on a Friday afternoon. A call from an old family friend, a woman from my mother's garden club. Her voice was syrupy with false concern. "Clara, dear, I'm just calling to see how you are. We're all so worried. There are such terrible rumors going around." "What kind of rumors, Eleanor?" I asked, my voice flat. "Well," she said, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper, "the real estate community is just buzzing. Kenneth's associates are saying that you've sabotaged his Seabrook Tower project out of some kind of family jealousy, that you're using your newfound wealth to punish him." Of course, that was the narrative they'd chosen. I wasn't a woman setting a boundary. I was a vindictive sibling enacting a petty revenge. "And what do you think, Eleanor?" I asked. She let out a nervous little laugh. "Oh, I'm sure it's all just a misunderstanding. But you know how people talk." I did know, and I knew my family had just fired the first shot in a war for public opinion. The calls started trickling in after that. Charleston's small, interconnected world was alive with the story. It had two distinct versions. In the world of developers and finance, Kenneth's world, I was the villain, the unstable sister who'd come into money and decided to destroy her brother's legacy. They saw the $16 million for the foundation not as an act of philanthropy, but as a weapon. But in my world, the world of preservationists, academics, and artists, the story was very different. An email from a colleague at the Preservation Society said it all. "Clara, we heard what you did, standing up to the developers in your own family and then establishing a fund to protect the very history they want to demolish. You're a hero." I was either a hero or a villain, depending on who was telling the story. It was a strange feeling to be the subject of gossip in a city where I had spent my entire life trying to be invisible. The real target, I knew, was Kenneth. For a man like him, reputation was everything. The Seabrook Tower wasn't just a building. It was a monument to his own ego. The whispers about his project failing, about his own sister refusing to back him, were more damaging than any financial shortfall. His investors would get nervous. His partners would question his judgment. He was losing control of the narrative, and for someone like Kenneth, that was a fate worse than bankruptcy. I knew he would have to do something big, something public, something designed to reclaim his image as the golden boy, the visionary. I found out what it was on a Tuesday morning. A friend from college sent me a link with a single line of text. You might want to see this. It was a promotional clip for a popular business podcast called The Bottom Line. The host, a well-respected local journalist, was teasing the week's upcoming episode. This week, his voice boomed. We sit down with one of Charleston's most ambitious young developers, Kenneth Harrison, for an exclusive interview. He's here to set the record straight on the rumors surrounding his flagship project and a very public family dispute. The clip ended with a shot of Kenneth sitting across from the host, his face, a mask of practiced sincerity. There are two sides to every story, he said, looking directly into the camera, and I think it's time people heard mine. I clicked off the video, a cold, calm certainty settling in my stomach. This was his move. Not a private conversation, not an attempt at reconciliation, but a public performance. He was going to go on air and paint himself as the victim, the hard-working son, betrayed by his jealous, unstable sister. He was going to use a public platform to lie, to manipulate, to spin the story until he was the hero again. The old Clara would have panicked. She would have called him, yelled, cried, maybe even tried to contact the podcast to stop it. But the woman sitting in her quiet office, surrounded by the evidence of her own hard-won success, just felt a profound sense of pity. He didn't understand. He still thought this was a game you could win with the right performance. He was walking into a trap of his own, making armed with nothing but the arrogance that had been his downfall all along. The podcast was scheduled to air the next day. I knew I had to listen. I owed it to myself to hear the final desperate performance of the golden boy as his kingdom crumbled around him. The podcast went live at 9 a.m. I made coffee, sat at my desk, and opened my laptop. I didn't feel nervous. I felt clinical, like an architect studying a building for structural weaknesses, knowing exactly where the cracks were. The host's voice was smooth, professional. "Kenneth, thank you for being here. There's been a lot of speculation about your Seabrook Tower project. Let's clear the air." Kenneth's voice was even smoother. He was good at this. He'd had a lifetime of practice at being charming. "Thank you for having me, John. I appreciate the opportunity to share my side of the story." He spent the first 10 minutes painting a masterpiece of manipulation. He was the devoted son, the ambitious developer, trying to build a legacy for his family. He spoke of unfortunate family disagreements and a sister he loved dearly who was going through a difficult time. He never mentioned the $16 million. He never mentioned the national prize. He just made me sound fragile, emotional, and a little bit unstable. My sister is a very passionate person, he said, his tone dripping with false sympathy. And sometimes that passion leads to misunderstandings. This project has become the focus of that, unfairly, I think. Passionate. That was the word he chose for principled. Misunderstanding. That was what he called betrayal. I took a slow sip of coffee. He was laying the foundation brick by brick. The devoted brother, the patient son, the reasonable businessman. The host, to his credit, didn't let him stay there. Let's pivot from the family dynamics to the project itself, John said, his tone shifting. The site you're developing, the old Hawthorne block. There was significant community pushback a decade ago about preserving those buildings. Your sister Clara was at the forefront of that movement. Now you're asking her to fund a project that will demolish the very history she fought to protect. From an ethical standpoint, how do you square that circle? There it was, the crack in the foundation. I leaned closer to the screen. Kenneth laughed, a sound that was meant to be easy and dismissive but came out just a little too sharp. John, we have to be realistic here. We're talking about progress. Charleston is a growing city. You can't let a few crumbling warehouses stand in the way of that. My sister's efforts back then were, well, they were a college project. Sentimental, admirable in a naive sort of way. But some would call it a conflict of interest, the host pressed. Asking her to fund the destruction of a site she considers a landmark. And that's when he broke. The mask of the charming developer didn't just slip, it shattered. Kenneth leaned into the microphone, his voice suddenly hard-laced with the condescending anger. I knew so well. You want to talk about ethics. The only thing unethical is stopping progress for the sake of nostalgia. It's this sentimental nonsense, this obsession with old crumbling buildings that holds cities back, this clinging to the past. It's stupid. He was on a roll now, the years of resentment toward my hobby pouring out of him. My sister's work, this whole preservation movement, it's anti-progress. It's a vanity project for people who can't handle the real world of business and development. They want to live in a museum. I want to build a future. He sat back then, a smug, satisfied look on his face, as if he'd just delivered a brilliant, unassailable argument. The host was silent for a beat, clearly taken aback. So, to be clear, he said, slowly, you believe your sister's life's work, the work that just won her the National Prize for Historical Preservation, is stupid. The silence in the studio was deafening. I could see the panic flash in Kenneth's eyes as he realized what he'd said. He'd forgotten I wasn't just the quiet hobbyist sister anymore. I was the award-winning architect. He had just publicly insulted not just me, but my entire field, my entire community. He started to backtrack, stammering about how he didn't mean stupid in a literal sense, how he respected my passion, but the damage was done. It was all there recorded. Every arrogant, dismissive, contemptuous word. I closed my laptop. I didn't need to hear the rest. He had just handed me the weapon, loaded it, and pointed it at his own head. He thought he was controlling the narrative. He didn't realize he had just become the story. A moment later, my phone buzzed. A text from my friend at the Preservation Society, then another from a colleague, then an email, then another text. The sound was like the first patter of rain against a window. The storm had just broken. By the time I poured my second cup of coffee, the clip was everywhere. It had been edited, subtitled, and set to dramatic music. Someone had even made a version that cut between Kenneth calling preservation stupid and a shot of my face from the National Prize Gala accepting my award. The contrast was devastating. My phone didn't ring with family anger. Not at first. It started with professional curiosity. An email from a board member at the Preservation Society with the subject line, "Well, that was something." A text from a contractor I worked with, "Saw your brother's podcast." Ouch! The local architectural blogs picked it up first, framing it as a battle between Charleston's future and its past. Then, the business journals caught on seeing a different story, a developer so arrogant he'd publicly insult a major community stakeholder, his own sister. I scrolled through the comments not with satisfaction, but with a kind of detached horror. They weren't just criticizing his opinion, they were dissecting his character. The entitlement is breathtaking. This is the kind of guy who thinks rules don't apply to him. I wouldn't invest $1 with someone this reckless. The first real domino fell at 11 a.m. I got a call from an old acquaintance who worked in commercial finance. "Clara," he said, his voice, a low rush of gossip, "are you seeing this? The primary equity partner for Seabrook just pulled out. The whole firm is in panic mode." He pulled out completely, cited a loss of confidence in project leadership. That's finance speak for "your brother is a public relations nightmare and we want out." He paused. "Honestly, Clara, you didn't have to do anything." He handed them the shovel and dug his own grave. That's when my family's silence finally broke. My father called. I let it go to voicemail. Then my mother. And again. I listened to one of her messages. Her voice, a high-pitched shriek of panic and blame. "You did this, Clara. You set him up. This was your plan all along, to ruin him. You've destroyed your brother. You've destroyed this family." I deleted the message. There was no mention of what Kenneth had actually said. No acknowledgement of his public, unprompted attack on my life's work. In their version of the story, his words didn't matter. Only my reaction, or the world's reaction, did. The problem wasn't his cruelty. The problem was that people had noticed. I felt a dull ache in my chest. There's no victory in having your worst fears about the people you're supposed to love confirmed so publicly. There's just the grim, hollow certainty that you were right all along. The final blow came just before the end of the workday. Another text from my finance acquaintance. "It's over. The bank just officially called the loan. The Seabrook project is dead in the water." I read the words and felt quiet. I thought of Kenneth's grand vision, his glass tower that would redefine the skyline. I thought of the old Hawthorne block, the warehouses he'd called piles of old bricks. The project designed to erase that piece of history was now itself about to be erased. The ghosts of those old buildings had won. I hadn't made a single call. I hadn't sent a single email to an investor. I hadn't asked anyone to do anything. Kenneth had walked onto that stage believing he was the hero of his own story. He'd had the spotlight, the microphone, the audience. He had everything he'd always been given, and he'd used it to broadcast his own downfall. I hadn't needed revenge. His own character had been consequence enough. The news of Kenneth's bankruptcy wasn't a headline. It was a whisper that grew into a roar in the small insular world of Charleston business. It wasn't a quiet, dignified process. It was a fire sale. The sports car he'd bought to celebrate closing the initial funding for Seabrook Tower was repossessed. His membership at the yacht club was revoked for non-payment. His name, once a symbol of ambitious next-generation development, became a cautionary tale whispered over cocktails at parties he was no longer invited to. I heard he was working for another firm, now a junior position, starting over from the bottom. The golden boy had lost his shine. But it was the house that truly marked the end. I saw it online. A real estate listing with professional sun-drenched photos that made the place look warmer and more welcoming than it had ever felt to me. Classic Charleston charm with modern amenities, the description read. A home filled with decades of family memories. I looked at the pictures of the living room where my achievements were never displayed, the dining room where my opinions were never heard, the backyard where Kenneth's victories were celebrated with extravagant parties I was expected to help with, but never truly be a part of. The listing photos were beautiful, sterile, and completely devoid of the suffocating tension that had filled those rooms my entire life. They were selling a fantasy. A fantasy they had believed in so completely they'd sacrificed their own daughter to maintain it. I heard through a distant cousin that the sale was necessary to cover the debts they'd taken on to fund Kenneth's lifestyle, to prop up the illusion of his success for years. Their retirement was gone. The investments they'd always lorded over me were gone. The foundation of their world, built on Kenneth's supposed brilliance, had crumbled, and it was taking everything with it. It wasn't just financial. It was social. The invitations stopped coming. My mother, who had built her identity around being the wife of a respected man and the mother of a rising star, suddenly found her social calendar empty. The phone calls she made went unreturned. Friends who had once flocked to their holiday parties now crossed the street to avoid her. The whispers were merciless. Did you hear about the Harrisons lost everything? And their own daughter, the successful one, wouldn't even help them. They had spent a lifetime currying favor, building a reputation based on appearances. But Charleston, for all its old-world charm, has a sharp memory for failure and an even sharper one for hypocrisy. I should have felt something. Triumph, maybe. A sense of vindictive satisfaction. But all I felt was a strange, hollow, quiet, like standing in the wreckage of a building that had been destined to fall all along. I hadn't pushed it. I had simply stepped out of the way and stopped holding it up. They had built their dynasty on a faulty foundation, on the myth of one child's superiority and the reality of the other's silent, unacknowledged support. They hadn't built a legacy. They'd built a stage. And when the audience left and the lights went out, there was nothing left. They moved into a small rental apartment on the other side of town, in a neighborhood they used to drive through with their windows up and their doors locked. The great Harrison family, the ones who valued vision and progress above all else, had become invisible, just like they had always made me feel. I read the listing for my childhood home just once. The pictures showed empty rooms that felt like strangers. The real estate agent's words about decades of family memories felt like a lie. Their memories were not my memories. Their legacy had been a performance, and the show was finally over. I felt no satisfaction watching them fall. There was no triumph in their collapse, only a quiet, aching finality. Their kingdom, built on the shifting sands of Kenneth's ego and my parents' willful blindness, had been a house of cards all along. A single gust of truth had been enough to bring it all down. They had spent their lives chasing a certain kind of legacy, one of wealth, status, and a golden son who would carry the family name to new heights. Now their legacy was a failed project, a foreclosed home, a reputation in tatters. I decided mine would be different. The first official act of the Harrison Legacy Preservation Fund was not a grand announcement. It was a quiet transaction. The day after Kenneth's bankruptcy was finalized, I sat in my lawyer's office and signed the papers to acquire the Hawthorne block. All of it. The land he had intended for his glass tower, the ground under which the ghosts of those beautiful old warehouses lay buried. The price was a fraction of what Kenneth had paid. The bank just wanted it off their books. They saw a failed development site. I saw a promise waiting to be kept. That afternoon I walked the property alone. The demolition had been brutal but incomplete. Some of the original foundations were still visible, peeking through the weeds like broken teeth. I ran my hand over a fragment of old brick, its surface rough and cool. I wasn't the 20-year-old girl with a petition and a trembling voice anymore. I was the woman with the resources to rebuild. The woman who understood that a real legacy isn't about what you build for yourself. It's about what you save for everyone else. We didn't just buy the land. We bought back a piece of the city's soul. The work began almost immediately, not with bulldozers and wrecking balls, but with brushes and trowels. I hired a team of architectural historians and archaeologists. We spent weeks carefully excavating the site, documenting what was left, salvaging every piece of the original ironwork, every intact piece of stone that could be repurposed. It was a slow, painstaking process, a direct contradiction to Kenneth's world of fast money and disposable history. The Foundation's first public announcement wasn't a press release. It was a simple sign erected at the edge of the property. It had a rendering not of a new shiny tower, but of the Hawthorne block as it once was. Below the image, the text was simple: "The Hawthorne Historic District, Restoration in Progress. The Harrison Legacy Preservation Fund." My phone rang 2 days later. It was my father. I almost didn't answer, but I did. His voice was different, thinner, defeated. I saw the sign Clara. I waited. "What you're doing? It's a good thing he said the words, sounding like they cost him something. Your professor, Mr. Harrison, he would have been proud." "Yes," I said. "He would have been. He trailed off. I wanted you to know. I see it now." I didn't know what to say to that. An apology, an acknowledgement. It was too little too late, and yet it was something. "Thank you for saying that," I said, and then "Goodbye, Dad." I hung up not with anger, but with a quiet sense of closure. He finally saw it, but he was seeing it from the other side of the wall. I had built a wall that was no longer a prison, but a boundary. The project became my life. I was on site every day working alongside the restoration team. We weren't just rebuilding structures, we were resurrecting a story. The story of the craftsmen who laid those bricks, the merchants who worked behind those windows, the city that grew up around them. One morning I stood inside the shell of the largest warehouse, the one that would become the centerpiece of the restored district. Sunlight streamed through the high-arched windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. A group of young interns from the local university's architecture program stood around a makeshift table, their faces bright with excitement. They were the first recipients of the Foundation's student grants. I unrolled a set of blueprints across the dusty surface, the original 19th century plans we had recovered from the city archives. "Okay," I said, and my voice was full of a purpose I had never known before. "Let's begin." The sun feels different here in the courtyard of the restored Hawthorne block. It's warm, it's real, it's mine. I'm standing with a group of architectural students, the first recipients of the Harrison Fund scholarships. They're young, eager, full of questions. I'm pointing out the reclaimed ironwork on a balcony, explaining how we used 19th century techniques to repair it. I see a flicker of my younger self in one of them, a quiet girl in the back sketching furiously in her notebook, her eyes full of a fierce, focused passion. She doesn't need the spotlight. She just needs the space to create. My work is to give her that space. I hear about my family sometimes through the quiet hum of the city. They live in a smaller house now across town. The sale of their grand home barely covered Kenneth's debts. I heard he works a job he hates, managing inventory for a shipping company. My father plays golf at the public course, not the country club. My mother keeps a low profile. They are ghosts in a city that has forgotten their name. I feel no triumph in this knowledge. Only a deep, quiet sadness for the legacy they chose to build and the one they chose to abandon. Their story is over. Mine is just beginning. And in that moment, looking at the hopeful faces of these young architects, I realized this story isn't just mine anymore. It's yours. If you were the one on the sidelines, the one who was always told to be sensible while your sibling was encouraged to be spectacular, if you're the quiet one, the afterthought, the one whose achievements were met with a distracted nod while their failures were met with a bailout, if you have ever felt invisible in the rooms that were supposed to be your home, then this is for you. I need you to hear this. Their neglect was not a reflection of your worth. It was a reflection of their limitations. Their inability to see you was not a judgment of your value. It was a symptom of their own blindness. You spent years making yourself smaller, quieter, less demanding, hoping that if you took up less space, they might finally notice the space you occupied. You learned to celebrate your own victories in silence, because the sound of your joy felt like an inconvenience to their curated narrative. You are not too sensitive. You are not dramatic. You are not ungrateful. You are a person who was starved of recognition and somehow miraculously learned to feed yourself. So let me tell you what I wish someone had told me at that empty table at my own celebration. You do not need their permission to be magnificent. Your worth is not a negotiation. Your legacy isn't what they failed to give you. It's what you choose to build from the ashes. Stop waiting for an invitation to a table where you were never meant to be celebrated. Walk out of the empty rooms where you were never seen. Take all the love you were willing to give them and pour it into yourself. Pour it into your work. Pour it into the community that sees you, the friends that choose you, the passion that ignites you. And build something. Build a business, a foundation, a garden. A life so full of purpose and light that their shadows can no longer reach you. That is your legacy. That is your victory. Build something beautiful in its place. Here in the heart of what I chose to save, I finally understand. My real legacy wasn't the inheritance I fought for. It was the one I built when I finally stopped asking for a seat at their table and built my own.